Hi, I'm Dr. Jaime Romo, and I'm presenting today the second part of the three-part series, Recovery Time. In the first part, we looked at the big question, who am I? And one of the big ideas was that we're not just human beings having a spiritual experience, but we're spiritual beings having a human experience. Today, the focus is, what do I want? And of course, we want to be happy. There are a lot of things that get in the way, so I'm going to present a little bit about some of what we know about what gets in the way, overwhelming experiences and the way we internalize them and how they affect us in our bodies and our mind and our spirit. And then the next one will be what's our purpose, which is really about helping people. But sometimes we're not very good at that. So I hope today will be useful as we think about being healthy, happy, whole, and kind of recognizing where we are in the process. So things can happen to us. We can be a victim of something, and in that we can be overwhelmed. And there's no judgment in that. There's nothing wrong with that. How do we recover? How do we grow from that? How do we have post-traumatic growth? A lot of times, though, people then get into survivor mode. So we're out of the immediate thing that happened or series of things that happened, and we're proud of that. We call ourselves survivors, and there's a show about that, and there's whole groups and just ways that people describe themselves. And that's limiting. I mean, it's better than living in a victim experience, and I'll talk more about that. But there's something different, So the victim is caught up in whatever the overwhelm is, whatever the harm, the trauma. Survivors are kind of living often in the here and then. We're getting triggered by previous stuff, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then ideally I'm calling it a survivor-thriver kind of stage. And this isn't all perfectly linear, but it's a time where we take responsibility, for whatever we're carrying, whatever's happened to us. We take responsibility for what we've done to ourselves and maybe what we've done to others. And we integrate, and that's a process. But that helps us to be more connected, healthier, more whole. And at that point, then, we can deal with the things that come up in life differently. And also it leads then to this other place where people want to be, right? To be thrivers. Another way of looking at that is thinking of our emotional state. And certainly when we're having stuff happen to us that's out of our control, where we don't know who to trust or what to trust, we don't feel like we have a choice about things, we feel powerless. We can be in that first column, the powerlessness is the starting point. And then, even though anger is not a good thing to express or feel, it's better than powerlessness. But that's really kind of more, I think, the victim experience. And this isn't a perfect model. There are plenty of others, and I'll show later. But then the next one, say the survivor, I'm kind of identified some of these emotions with survivors as blaming, ourselves or others for things, or being caught up in worry and doubt of ourselves, again, not knowing who to trust and so on, and frustration with things not being the way we really want them to be and not knowing how to get there. And then the next column is really in that kind of survivor-thriver place of just being more connected, be more at peace. Boredom is not a great thing, but what a gift compared to anger and frustration and despair and depression. And we have some positive expectations for a lot of reasons, not just things that come to us, but things that we've been through. And we have confidence. We've healed, we've grown, we've integrated more of those things, and they become resources so then we can help others. There's an analogy of when I've been in different kinds of support groups, and I think of when people are early in the recovery process and then try to help somebody else. To me, it's like if somebody gets thrown into deep end of a pool or ocean or something, and they're not a good swimmer and they're panicking, and someone else who's not a very good swimmer either tries to jump in and save them, well, they might both drown. Right? So there's something about we have to heal, we have to learn some new skills that then we can deal with someone else and actually be helpful. So I'll talk a little bit. So these are some good things. We want to be happy, right? We want to have joy, but there are some things that get in the way. And I mentioned that when things are happening to us, we often don't feel safe, don't know who to trust, don't feel we have choices or can navigate and use our voice, and we feel powerless. And so part of the healing process is to be with people who are safe, do things for ourselves that are safe. I mean, that's a foundational piece. And knowing that we can trust ourselves and others, another foundational piece. Being able to work together, being able to use our voice and negotiate and figure things out is empowering. Right? So these are like the core things. These come from SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Agency. And there are a lot of others that have identified as well, but these are, I think, the pillars. These are actually kind of the original 5 that they came up with to say, when these things are, when we're overwhelmed, we feel the opposite. And so if we're going to be effective in healing and growing and helping others, this is the kind of stuff we need to have in place. So it's called trauma-informed principles. Trauma is an unpleasant word. Nobody really likes to focus on that. But just give you a quick definition. And there are plenty of definitions. This is my favorite because it doesn't judge and discriminate and make decisions for other people about what is overwhelming. So Beverly James says, trauma occurs when an actual or a perceived threat or danger or loss overwhelms a person's usual coping ability. So it doesn't have to be a real physical threat. It could just be, we think we lost our car keys, or, somebody insult us and we've kind of lost face. I mean, any number of things can overwhelm us. And the same thing doesn't impact people the same way, probably because people have different resiliency, different coping skills, different sense of knowing who they are, and a different history. So how long does the overwhelm have to last for a traumatic memory? And this is important because the memories all of a sudden are going to show up later in a lot of ways. Just a split second. It's not like something that takes a long time is necessarily going to have a worse impact as something that happens really quickly. And how does someone identify an area of poor coping ability? Well, usually in the extremes, and we'll talk a little bit about that, in a few. But when someone really has a strong reaction, really overreacts to something, or the opposite, when they really underreact, when really, disconnect and are not present, when they can't talk about something. So think about, what happened yesterday. At the Capitol, we had, in a sense, people lost their minds. Right? And there's a lot of complicated stuff with that, and I actually want to talk about in the next presentation. But I'll use this simple model with Daniel Siegel, who's a Harvard physician, who talks about our brains, right? And we think about the hand, it kind of looks like a brain. In our development, the lizard brain is the thing that all lizards and animals have in common with us, and it takes care of our basic functions. And then the mammalian brain is what gives us emotions and connection with animals and mammals, horses and elephants and dolphins, all these different animals. Monkeys have a sense of relatedness to one another and can show compassion. And then this part is the most developed part that makes us amazing. It helps us to imagine things that don't exist and make them real. But when we get overwhelmed with something, there's a neurophysiological response, right? There's a quick set of actions that help us to defend ourselves, right? The fight-flight response, where our lizard brain takes over. And so what happens real quickly, and you probably know this, is that we have an alarm system, the amygdala. It goes off like warning, something's dangerous. Cortisol flushes through our body and our brains, and it sets off all kinds of reactions, right? So the blood leaves our core and it goes into the arms and legs, extremities. And this is an old thing to survive, like in case the saber-toothed cat was going to scratch, you wouldn't bleed together. So you got platelets out there, and you've got the blood and the sugar is going to your system to run, to fight, to flight. And your immune system shuts down because you don't need that in a moment of defense. Your digestive system shuts down. You don't need that. Your reproductive system, things that help us to feel healthy and young and vital. All those things shut down just to fight or flee. Right? And that's good in the short term. And that's how we're wired for all kinds of things. So we may get cut off in traffic. We may anticipate, a phone call we don't like. We may be surprised. And all these things happen just like that. Right? And then we don't necessarily reset like animals do in the wild. You see them shake off after a gazelle or whatever gets away from a lion. They physically shake off all the chemicals that are floating around in them. But we don't necessarily do that. We need to reset. And when we don't reset, it affects our bodies. And there's a lot to this. It makes sense, that with all the adrenaline going through us, our blood pressure goes up, right? Our breath is short, and it helps us to be ready to fight or flee. But over time, it's going to weaken our heart. And the stress hormones, it makes it more difficult for us to sleep. We may have anxiety. And as a result, some people actually may start taking things to not feel that, to disconnect, to numb, or to help them to sleep. So we start relying on outside things to help us. Why do we have so much diabetes? Well, if we got that glucose running through our system and we don't reset, and then on top of that, because we want the quick energy, we look for carbs. Our body is wired to look for carbs. We have increased blood sugar, so it's a big connection to stress that we have all these health issues. Digestive disturbances, if our digestive system shuts down, it's gonna be susceptible to all kinds of digestive issues and ultimately ulcers even. The reduced growth hormones, so aging is a factor for caregivers. It's a stressful, ongoing experience. People age much more. The platelets, I give platelets every month, and those are good things to help people who have cancer, get blood transfusions or burn to help, the healing. Well, those sticky platelets are good in the moment, to help us not bleed out. But over time, they can give us headaches, give us migraines, give us strokes. Right? So there are these direct physical connections between stress and that stress response. Now, here's the real quick summary of how trauma works. There are different kinds of trauma, and I just described the single incident. Something overwhelms us. But there's also, the trauma and the stress that impacts in the womb, pre-birth, and just shortly after birth. That really affects the wiring of the brain. The chain represents historical trauma, slavery, different experiences that have impacted a whole community that have been perpetuated. The student at the desk is developmental. As we grow, we're exposed over time to different stressful things. And again, without a relief, without balancing, without, integrating, they add up. And then the astronaut for your planet, this is generational. How the experience of grandparents can be passed on to their kids and to their kids, even if we're not even aware of their experiences. It's an amazing thing. And so here's the real quick kind of Vietnam story where we started to learn about PTSD. So person's out in the field, surrounded, by trees, chewing gum, helicopter sound of children, and all of a sudden there's the ambush and the rage because the person's in fight-flight mode and fearing for their life. And then they get out of that somehow. And maybe there's all, the death around them. Maybe there's the guilt that's associated with surviving, these all kinds of things. But now they're out of it. Right? And then maybe now they're in the park. They're having a barbecue, civilian life, sound of kids, chewing gum. There's a dog barking in the past. There's a barbecue grill, some new elements, some old elements. And something happens. Maybe it's the kids or the trees, but the person just goes into this rage again. They get out of that. It's easy to blame something else. We don't make sense of it. Now maybe the person's at home and sound of kids in traffic and, enjoying a cigar, dog barks, having a conversation with wife. Maybe there's a disagreement and all of a sudden, another rage. Now they're out of that situation. Celebrating with friends, maybe 4th of July, intoxicated, cigar, with friends, again, sounds of kids and explosion sound, all of a sudden again, rage in a time where people might be celebrating. And then another time, maybe the person down the road is just by themselves watching TV, inebriated, having a cigar, and no apparent reason, rage. And you've seen road rage. I've seen people in stores when someone gets too close to them, all of a sudden it looks like they're going to attack them. And it doesn't make sense, right? And so what happened in the first trauma doesn't at all look like what happened in the last rage. It doesn't make sense because we have this network, this web of trauma, unresolved stuff that is still running through our system that gets triggered. I'm going to show you a real quick video of someone talking about their own experience, how they ended up in the streets. And I'll make the quick connection between all these unresolved experiences over time impact our physical and our behavioral health.
By the time I was 13, I was shell-shocked by the way I had grown up, which was very violent, among other abuses. And I was not emotionally very stable. Then my mom hooked up with a guy, and they started using a lot of drugs. They got me involved in their drug use. It caused me to have all kinds of other problems, stealing and stuff like that. And they decided that I had a drug problem, and they sent me off to treatment, which was cool because I learned how to get sober. But when I came home, it was all the same shit. I was supposed to stay sober, but they were using drugs. They were taking me to parties. There were drugs in the house. And I actually really wanted to be sober. So I decided to leave. I had the clothes on my back. I took off. I was about 16 then, and that's the first time I became homeless.
So what you saw was a person given some background of things that happened to them that ended up in being out in the street. Things that impacted their sense of safety, sense of who to trust, sense of having a choice about things, sense of being powerlessness. And a shift when we think about being happy, being our best self, is not like what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And so here's this ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences, came out in '98 with Vince Felitti, a San Diego Kaiser Permanente physician, 17,000 members, patients had their records, and they found a correlation between certain things growing up. They had these 10 questions, there are a lot more, things that happened to them as children, things that happened around them, things that they did, and then things they found out they internalized about themselves. And some of them have to do with physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse. Some of these have, scarcity, poverty, just not sure of how they're going to survive. The stability of the parents was not good. Maybe people were violent around each other. Maybe someone went to jail and so on. And they found this amazing correlation that people with 4 or more, 3 or more, were most likely to have respiratory diseases. People with 4 or more, or 5 or more, were more likely to have serious health consequences that shorten their life. Alzheimer's, dementia. Someone who had, I think this is 3 or more, had 2.5 times more likely to have a stroke, have cancer, heart disease, 1.5 times more likely to have diabetes. And when people had even more, like 7, they're more likely 38 times, or 3,800%. It's an incredible correlation, likely to have attempted suicide. So mental health, behavioral health is completely affected by unresolved stuff that we carry around. And so we have this amazing quote to say, addiction is somewhat explainable. It's not only like this disease, things that happen and is passed on through generations. So there's some of that biologically. There's also the coping mechanism kind of gone to an extreme. Like we numb if we're stressed out and we can't sleep. And then we have certain behaviors to deal with the anxiety and so on. Those can snowball. And so this is a radical statement. Addiction is best viewed as an understandable, unconscious, compulsive use of psychoactive materials that otherwise you can't talk about because there's shame related to them. So trauma affects our lives. It disrupts our lives, our sense of who we are, making meaning for ourselves. We'll see that people can be more aggressive. People can react to law enforcement for good reason and other times for no good reason. People cannot know who to trust and just disengage from situations. Minor incidents, being bumped or cross word or whatever, can send people off. And so what I did in writing the workbook, which is available through lived experiences is just map out how people can operate from these different stages. And, my hope is that we want to be happy. We don't want to hate. We don't want to hate ourselves or other people. And so as a way to think about that, I have some sayings, some wisdom, advice that looks different from the different stages. So the 3 R's of respect for self, for others, and responsibility for actions. Well, victims are in that crisis mode. Right? Survivors are trying to figure things out and beat the system. There's not a lot of trust. Survivors, thrivers, are taking responsibility. I mentioned the 4 agreements. Let your word be impeccable. Don't take things personally. Don't assume. Do your best. And the thrivers, they want to be the change. Love deeply and passionately. You might get hurt, but it's the only way to live. Sounds great. But from a victim place, there's abuse. Others to us or us to ourselves. From a survivor place, it's trying not to get hurt. Again, not trying to figure things out. Survivor thriver is loving self, being present to self, being good to ourselves. And thrivers is extending that, helping others to have that. Don't believe all you hear, spend all you have, or sleep all you want. Common sense. Victims are in this addictive place, right? No limits. Survivors in a kind of an excessive reaction place. Survivors, thrivers, be more flexible. Thrivers, how do we co-create and live, create the future we want. Never laugh at anyone's dream. People who don't have dreams don't have much. Beautiful. Survivors, and I've experienced these myself. They came from my own experience, and I see from others. Victims steal, crush others' dreams. We have the Pain Olympics, and survivors follow other people's dreams rather than having really their own. And survivor thrivers, dream, and we share our dreams, and others we live. And the last, give people more than they expect and do it cheerfully. What a beautiful way to live. Right? But from a victim place, we're about stealing and not having enough, and it's survival. And survivors are hoarding, right? Or we're going to give, but it's not what am I getting back? And survivor thrivers giving to those we like. Thrivers giving to those we don't like. So again, there are different models, ways that people think of going through these stages, but it's all in the direction of becoming more whole, becoming more healed and happy. In the first talk, we talked about who am I? Spiritual being having a human experience, and this human experience can be pretty wild. What do we want? We want to be happy. We want to be whole. And that's a process. And there are trauma-specific resources that will help people to integrate. One of them is traumatic incident reduction. I promote it a lot because I've facilitated. It's been powerful in my own healing. And what's our purpose? We'll talk about that next time. How do we serve, especially in the context of the type of division and mistrust and things that get triggered for people from all different backgrounds. So thank you, and I look forward to presenting again.
Welcome to Premas, episode 2, by Lived Experiences. We are here with Dr. Jaime Romo. He just did an amazing presentation, which was part 2 of a 3-part series. If you missed the first one, you need to go to the YouTube channel and check it out. The first one was who we are. Today is what do we want? And then if you keep up, next time we're going to talk about, please help me.
What's our purpose?
What is our purpose? Yes, that's awesome. So purpose driven. But what do we want? That is today's question. I love the first one where you talked about who we are, but you didn't just make it a general presentation. You pretty much just laid out your whole life right in front of us and said, look, this is who or what it took to create the person that I am today, and how I have had all these accomplishments, even though I had all the challenges and I went through all the different trauma and different states of, say, depression and whatnot, and still became a successful person. And now I'm sharing and helping others and growing with others. I love the interactivity that you talked about. But now it's about what we want. Happiness, right? We want to be happy. Everybody wants to be happy, right? And you touched on some points about how I want to say, and if I'm wording it wrong, please correct me, but how the animal in us plays a role. You know, you talked about, I think you call it the reptilian brain,
The lizard brain.
the
Yeah,
lizard
yeah.
brain, yeah. And you talked about fight or flight, and the different chemicals that come into play. But happiness, if you just think about the word happiness, it seems like an easy thing, but it's not. And I guess if you think about maybe a child, right? A child is born, you could almost say perfect, right? God creates perfect children. At least that's what I believe. And yet, as parents, we go in and we screw them up, right? We mess them up, or the environment, or whatever, you know, the people close to us. What kinds of things play a role in a child, and maybe at what age do children start to stray from that path in the direction of happiness? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, so from the very beginning, there are opportunities for deep connection and building the trust and building a sense of safety and, you know, building a sense of, you know, possibility and empowerment. And that's the ideal. And there are always, you know, inadvertently ways that gets disconnected. And there's this amazing video called the Still Face Experiment. And it's really powerful, really dramatic, where here's this mom who is playing with the child, and the child's really, you know, happy. And then all she does is look away. And when she comes back, she gets kind of neutral. And she hasn't abandoned, but the child, you know, doesn't get the interaction. And so early, kids are we're wired just to completely depend on and see ourselves as, you know, surviving because of that significant adult relationship. And when she doesn't respond emotionally effectively, the child starts to, you know, scream and trying to get attention. All of a sudden, there's wailing, and it's like traumatic because, like, all of a sudden, my life is threatened because I'm not getting that loving response. And so that's the thing. I mean, we have from the very beginning experiences of disconnect, experiences of feeling unsafe, and then we can recover. Right? That's a normal thing, and I think that's how we go throughout life. We have normal experiences of being, you know, abandoned, a normal experience of being neglected, normal experiences of feeling hurt, and we can recover from those if there's that reparation work, you know, in the environment and with the relationship. And I think that's where these things kind of like snowflakes start to build up, where in that moment of panic, from a place where the child doesn't even have language. Right? Yeah. And that's where, when, you know, later on where people talk about, you know, someone's acting out, well, it makes sense because we don't have a language for whatever the fear or the, you know,
to
interpretation is.
That feeling.
And adults can do that as well. But I'm just saying, you know, from the very beginning, these things can kind of like build up, and in that moment, the interpretation, the message is, you know, I'm not safe, or I'm not loved, or I'm not lovable, you know, and then maybe we go on, and then there's another experience that kind of adds or reinforces that similar kind of belief system, and so so we have both the opportunity. There's a danger, you know, the Mandarin symbols for crisis is danger and opportunity. You know, so in these developmental years in our life experiences, there's things that seem threatening to us, and then there's the opportunity to actually reinforce that we are safe. We can get through things. You know, we are good. We are lovable. And that opportunity isn't always taken, or it's not always provided for people to repair and to grow. And so over time, and then we make up stories about ourselves or about the environment or about people, and some of those may be true and some of those may be not true. But so, I mean, that's a hard thing of
but parenting plays a huge role, right? I mean, because when a child is born, their first experience is with their mother, and then hopefully the father, and then hopefully both, you know. But at some point, they reach an age, I guess, where they start to realize all of these things, right? They want attention. And then maybe a sibling comes along, and now they're competing for attention, right? And I follow a man named Tony Robbins, a pretty famous guy. I'm sure you probably heard of him. And at one point, I heard him say something about everybody's expressions are either an expression of love or an expression of what is it? The other one, like cry for help. right? And it kind of goes along with what you're saying. If a child reaches a point where they don't feel either safe, secure, or loved, they're going to react, right? And if they don't have language, it's probably going to look like a tantrum, stereotypically speaking. And then you get to an age where it's like, I don't know, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, right? You right before you become a teenager. And it almost seems like the reactions are a little more better thought out. They're more impactful, right? They're more maybe dramatic. But it's like it's a person coming into their own, and yet the world wants to see it as just a tantrum or just your typical, kid going through those hard ages. What I guess the question is, how proactive does one have to be to recover from trauma or these things? And is there a way to know the best ways to recover? You said in part of your presentation that animals will shake it off. They get done hunting where they catch their prey and they shake it off. But I don't know that I ever thought about that. Like, what do I do to recover? Like, or what are the actual things that I do? And how does one know, learn, or where can we find out what the things we need to do to recover?
Well, so, I mean, there's a whole field of child development that really needs a lot more attention and support nationally. I mean, and some countries do have a lot of good support for kids as they grow and so on. So a short answer is that we need more opportunities to express in a safe way. And so play is and what a shame that in schools we're getting more to like test driven and we don't have the playtime and we don't have the cut out arts and things that are creative that give people different ways to process their feeling. There's that great film Inside Out. And it's an animated Pixar film about emotions.
I remember that.
We have to acknowledge our emotions and have to develop an emotional, vocabulary. So, proactive, I guess, is just allowing ourselves to express. And so it's so important the way that artists take a role in society.
I was going to say that a lot of that is a creative thing.
I mean, they kind of reflect that on behalf of a larger group, oftentimes.
Visual arts, performing arts,
but in the individual, in our own development, I mean, we need to. I go back to in the first presentation, talked about being abandoned, abused, and wrapped in shame. And so things happen to me, and today I talked a little bit about things happen to us, and then we may internalize beliefs about ourselves, and the world, and others, and then we can kind of do those things to ourselves. We prevent ourselves from trusting more, or from doing new things, or taking care of ourselves because we've internalized. If I'm not lovable, or I'm not worth good things or good treatment, we may kind of reinforce that on our own. I know that was the case for me. I mean, so even if I was real successful, I was an administrator in a middle school, and I was wearing a tie, and I was had a good career, but inside I felt very ashamed, and nothing was good enough, and that was what I had internalized. So certainly we need to take care of ourselves physically, but we also need to allow ourselves to feel how we feel and not disconnect, and that's a common coping mechanism. And then we reinforce it. We feel like, don't feel that way. And,
and then it affects our actual physical health.
Yeah.
You were talking about, lack of energy and digestive problems and the chemicals going on that create almost, I guess you could say, a feeling of just wanting to not maybe do anything and maybe isolate yourself. I don't feel well today. I got a headache. I got this. I got that. And we look outside for stimulus, I guess, or to repair. I guess maybe we have social media we talk about and entertainment and TV. I mean, but then also things like consuming, say, sports drinks, on the lower level, right?
Yeah.
Red Bulls and all of just to get through the day, coffee. And then higher level, maybe some controlled drugs and things like that. Do you feel that we have everything within to be able to repair and be healthy, that we don't need that outside stimulus or whatever medication, self-medication?
Yeah, I think I mean, there is a purpose for it. And when people are in crisis, we definitely need something, to intervene. But I'd say for the majority, I mean, our bodies repair, and when our immune system is given a chance. There's Gabor Mate is real good, the Canadian physician, and talking about the correlations between our emotions and how we stifle and disconnect from ourselves, or and how that affects us. And he makes a real big case between anger. I mean, research about it. When we hold on to it, often it turns into cancer. I mean, it's a correlation to to not expressing. And so I mentioned expression, how important that is. And then on the opposite, when we really blow up all the time, it impacts our heart. I mean, there's the way we're wired, the chemicals go through us, they impact different organs. He makes a lot of presentations about when people are always like trying to please others and take care of others and not take care of ourselves emotionally or physically. There's a high correlation to MS or Lou Gehrig's disease. So we're socialized and we're reinforced for doing all kinds of things and not feeling and overperforming. And so all these coping mechanisms that sometimes we get rewarded for, or they help us in the short term, but in the long term, they really physically shorten our lives. And then with more illness, and not even to speak about the emotional side. To not be at peace with ourselves.
That was going to be my next question. What's that connection between the physical and say the spiritual and your emotions and all of that, to where it can be almost like this I don't know what to even call it, like this like a whirlwind of emotions or feelings, or where you try to compensate or self-medicate or stimulate with our mobile phones and internet, but it actually works in a negative way, and it brings you into a deeper state of, say, depression and things like that. And how are those two connected, the spiritual and the physical? Because we tend to feel, some people feel like they're not, or that spirituality really isn't a thing, maybe even. So
so one of the slides that showed said that when people experience some overwhelm or some trauma, it can disrupt our sense of meaning, sense of trust and all that. Certainly have physical impact, but also, especially, something as powerful as sexual abuse. And that's like affects 20% of the population at least. I mean, it's awful to even think of that, and that's the reality. But neglect is has one of the highest impacts on kids growing up, and that's traumatic, right? It disrupts our sense of meaning. Like, who am I, in this body? Who am I in this relationship, in this world? So it makes sense that people will try to do something that helps them feel better.
Exactly.
Physically, or comfort, or numb, or entertained. So that the connection between the overwhelm does impact our bodies, and the longer we continue, I think, to look for a way to feel better externally, it keeps us from connecting to our deeper self, our sense of, we've lost, who am I? Am I what other people think? Am I like this idea of being happy or successful or whatever? And I speak from just my own experience, of lived experience of, doing my best with what I have. But, it's not until we are in a place where we can have some perspective. And you mentioned, kids growing up 10, 11, well, their brains are just developing, and it takes at least 20 something years for our brains really to be fully developed. And that's why a lot of times people really don't fully kind of heal, all this past trauma, or these, series of things that have added up until we're much older, because then we can look back and have years. Language.
You said 24.
That's so normal.
It's so crazy. Because I feel like the answers are everywhere, right? If you go and do some research, read a book, or go find some information that has to do with what you're feeling, say, that it's there, yet we don't. I always go back to proactivity, right? If we don't know, because we don't know what we don't know, and if we don't know, how do we fix what we don't know, right? That's even an issue. But, I've seen situations where young people, 11, 12, 13, commit suicide. And that to me is like probably one of the worst. And sexual abuse is probably one of the causes of things like that. But where a child of that age decides that they're just giving up, things must have been pretty bad for it to get that way. And it must have been that kind of spiral, that downward spiral where everything that they did, even though it seemed like it was helping, whether it's food or drugs or entertainment or attention from the wrong kind of people, it just dug that hole deeper and deeper. And so it's like, how do we get out of that? How do we get out of that cycle that's just killing us, physically?
Yeah, it is. And the statistics are awful. People, and especially in the adolescent range, when if you think of a simple thing like holding a glass of water, not a big deal. But if you have to hold it for hours and hours after, well, it's painful. It adds up, and I think emotionally as well. If people may deal with some sadness or deal with some, something that kind of disrupts their sense of being a decent human being or being loved or whatever.
Yeah.
But again and again, that's that developmental trauma. That it's an awful experience for someone to feel so disconnected, so powerless, so helpless, in so much pain that they have no way to process anymore. The disconnect from making sense, right? But that idea of like seeing anybody actually in their behavior or their depression, like sadness is normal, right? But depression is that ongoing kind of spiral. To say, what happened to you? I get what's wrong. But it's not like there's something wrong with you, right? But what happened that has led to, the physical and the emotional and even the spiritual sense of loss or disconnect, that you do need the intervention.
So you intervention, identifying the things that maybe caused it, what happened to a person, and then recovery, right? Because we want happiness, right? So recovery. And so I know in the first presentation, you talked about healing together versus one person trying to help somebody else. And can you explain a little bit about how that healing works and how we can get closer to the happiness that we want?
I think the quote, there was one quote was like, if you're here to help me, you're wasting your time. But
I love that.
If you're here because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let's work together.
That's huge.
And I think that recognizes the interconnection we have, and some, from a very spiritual lens, Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk, and others talk about that we are all expressions of God. We're all interconnected. And the idea also is that we're social animals. We have these mirror images that can see in one another, and that reflects something back to us. So I don't know the exact science of it, except that I know that there's something about sharing that adds to our joy, and it helps us to let go and have some perspective on our sorrow.
You think belonging plays a role where you don't, because maybe a lot of people, if they're dealing with these challenges, they think everybody else seems happy. Right?
Yeah, belonging and community,
and
connection.
saying, okay, there's somebody else that we're healing together.
At the heart of trauma, the impact of it is disconnection.
Okay,
right?
yeah.
And there's a TED Talk that talks about the opposite of addiction is connection. So that when we are connected with ourselves, we're able to connect with others. When we're connected with others, it may help us to connect with ourselves. But when we're disconnected, and we tend to find things outside.
You think it gets replaced by addiction? The lack of connection?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, we're looking, it's an extreme form of it. We may look for that in simple ways, in something that we like to drink or taste, food or an activity, and things like that. They're short-term and meaningful and enjoyable.
What kind of impact do you think that like current events have on people, and the ease of just being able to pull up any social media platform and see what's going on the other side of the country. You know,
in the presentation, I talked about these 10 points that Phility and others talked about that correlated to all kinds of physical health issues and mental, emotional problems.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is that racism and poverty and people being exposed to war and having to leave a safe place and all kinds of things are traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And the being bombarded in social media with scary images and just terrible things. Not that we should ignore those, but to have that be coming at us and stimulating, that fear and so on, it's traumatic. It overwhelms us.
Yeah.
And that can then, again, we go offline. We're not thinking in our best self. We can go into that kind of survival mode, being fearful and disconnecting.
Mm-hmm.
So, too much TV, too much stuff that may be again real or perceived threat to us.
Yeah, I mean, and all of this stuff, it's so easy to find out about all these things with technology these days. And I mean, we could talk about this all day long, but we're actually running out of time. But maybe we can talk a little bit about just really quick on the first presentation, today's presentation, and what's to come, so that people can get an idea of what direction we're moving in and what we're trying to offer folks. Just real quick before we end.
Yeah, sorry. We look at the kind of what's going on today. We have these amazing conflicts and terrible things happen in the Capitol where people, burst into this federal building and someone died, another 4 people died.
Horrible.
So these are big questions. Who am I? What do I want? What's my purpose? And that first idea of, we want to be connected. We want to be spiritual. Who are we really? Spiritual people having a human experience. How do we learn about our own path to being connected and happy and healthy, whole, that allows us to work differently? And so what's our purpose? How do we help each other if we're coming from this reactive, triggered place or this fearful place? Well, we can't really. So the third one is really, how do we look at some of these big social issues and see how we can think differently so we can work differently, because we need to. I mean, literally our lives depend on it.
Yeah,
right?
That's huge. Well, there you have it, folks. Premas, episode 2. What do we want? Number 1 was who we are, and number 3 that's coming up will be what is our purpose. Dr. Jaime Romo, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it, and I enjoy the conversations that we have. But look us up on YouTube channel, Lived Experiences, the Premas Show. We're on episode 2, but we're going to have episode 3 coming to you soon. Thank you so much.